Hello, Jon.
Hello, Ron.
You are a philosophical practitioner, and you have been in the field for many, many years. I remember you from the very first time that we started an international conference in Vancouver.
That's right.
Yeah. And it's interesting that although you are a philosophical practitioner and the philosophical practice is often viewed as a movement that goes outside the academic world, you're actually practicing philosophical practice in the academic world because you teach at Milwaukee School of Engineering, which is an academic institution.
Yes.
So how does philosophical practice work in an academic institution? Can you tell us what you do there?
Yes. Look, if I'll explain first why I do it, why I don't do it on the outside. I did before. I had a practice. But I was always troubled by the fact that, first, why do we, as philosophers, not have dialogue among ourselves? Why should the relationship be so asymmetrical? And then the problem of the service orientation. I think the concept of instrumentality, which I've thought about for a long time, is practically vacuous.
Instrumentality that philosophy brings out some specific results.
Yeah, the idea of means to an end.
Means to an end. Philosophy is not a means to an end.
Well, in some way it must be if we're going to engage with people. But one problem with instrumentality is if you think that what you're doing is solving a problem, then of course anything that would solve the problem, taking a pill, would do just as well if it did, and you should accept that.
Or doing bad philosophy might solve that too.
Yeah. So, but obviously we don't want to do that. So then it can't be instrumentality that's essential to what we're doing.
Okay.
So what do philosophers, as practical philosophers, do otherwise? And it seems to me that thought is the central activity. And that's prior to any particular relationship in terms of service or anything else. So I naturally thought about what it was that I was doing as a teacher to engineers. So what is it that engineers could they use of philosophy? And at the same time, I teach engineers ethics primarily. And early in my career there, I was struck by a particular case that betrayed the usual representation of ethics, which is the Enlightenment view. What ought I to do? That the question of being in control. Well, we're not. I mean, that particular case and others indicate that we regret not having deliberated, not having thought to deliberate. And that means thoughtlessness. And it seems to me that what philosophers can offer is, as exemplars of thinking, as embodiments of thinking, what it is to be, what the importance of thinking is. And of course, where thoughtlessness is, that's a particular problem. That's a peculiarly philosophical problem. So I bring that to engineers.
So an important part of your goal is to make people who tend to be thoughtless, to make them more thoughtful.
Yes.
In everyday life, everyday moments.
In engineering in particular, and philosophers could find this in many different areas, but if in engineering and within professions which are, as sociologists call them, scholarly professions, professionals who are employed, their professional judgment tends to be repressed by their working circumstances. That's where thoughtlessness is. So engineers have this almost perfectionist difficulty that philosophers ought to provoke, that we're here to provoke the attitude that, look, you're a professional and you're supposed to use your judgment, but you don't, because of the thoughtlessness which your working circumstances occasion. And you can do something about that, and I will help you as a moral friend. If we can retrieve that concept from the history of philosophy, then the philosopher can be the moral friend of professionals and of any other population that philosophers might identify.
What kind of thinking can you add to those people? Is it mainly ethical thinking or other kinds of thinking?
It's thinking that promotes judgment. I'm borrowing from Hannah Arendt here, but Arendt says that thinking displaces anything else. That this is why professionals or any productive person doesn't think. As Heidegger says, thinking is out of order with anything else. But philosophers only think. So you have this very interesting tension or relationship between philosophers who embody thinking and professionals who can't think necessarily. If they're being productive, then they can't think. So the professional needs the philosopher as an exemplar of thinking, as a provocateur of their own thinking. I do this with my students, primarily in using conversation formats from Kessel's, Burr's, and Mostert's Free Space.
This is a Dutch group.
Yes, the Dutch management consulting firm, which have produced a very nice volume of exercises that they've developed. And I use primarily the rhetorical exercises because in the United States we're more freewheeling. It seems to work better. So what I have my students do is I give them a website with just a large number of cases, mainly having to do with college life. And I form a Google group.
Cases, these are...
Ethical cases.
Ethical cases.
Right, okay. Right. Having to do largely with college life.
Some ethical dilemma that is related to college life.
Yes, right. So noticing that a friend is using someone else's as notes for an exam or personal relationships. You have a friend who's is betraying a relationship with another friend, those sorts of things. So they will, on the discussion list, they will identify a case and they will get on the list and they'll invite people. I would like to do this case using this format at this time in this place. And then others will say, yes, I could do that. I'm interested. I'll show up. So we're utilizing the advantage of brick and mortar colleges by having your colleagues assemble face to face for a real dialogue.
So let's say 5 or 7 or 3 people, students, decide to come on Monday, 6 o'clock to a certain place and discuss a specific case.
Yes.
So what happens there?
Well, they will have read the case, they will have formed a view, they will have formed their own judgments. And then they have the stage where they can present a judgment. And the idea being that they do not have this stage in their place of work.
The stage is class?
In class, but for them, what I'm doing is giving them a taste of what could be possible in their professional lives. You know, we go through the cases that demonstrate the repression of professional judgment. And I said, this is what's missing in professional ethics. And let's see if we can change that. So here is a taste of what could be possible in your professional life. So ideally, you would like to make the judgment at the moment that it's called for. But I'm afraid that's hopeless. I think the best we can do is to have judgment at all, whenever it happens. So, for example, among these formats that I mentioned is one called pleading the case, where the idea is something must be said. So perhaps it's in your own case that you regret not having done something, not having deliberated. Now you remember. Now you can say, this is what I should have done.
Okay, so a case where the natural tendency is not to say anything, although maybe ethically you should have said something, so the next time that something similar happens, I may have more thought in my mind about whether or not to say something or not to say something.
Yes, ideally. And I think that the mechanism that works here is the notion of moral taste. If the problem is failing to notice the occasion for deliberation, then what would the Stoics do? The Stoics would say we need to cultivate vigilance so that we're always present. which is hopeless. But what we can do is in these conversations, in forming judgments independently, then we can know our own minds, what it is that offends me, what I think is admirable. And when I articulate this, I reinforce that taste, because what I'm trying to do is convince other people. So in having a moral taste, then in the workplace, even though I can't think, even though I can't bring my judgment to bear, something may strike me. I'm not sure that they would have a conversation of that depth otherwise.
Do you add something to the conversation, or are you a quiet listener?
I'm generally quiet. I'll encourage them occasionally. If I have something original to say, I might contribute it, but I certainly don't try not to dominate the conversation. What I've discussed is a group discussion led by students. What I would like to add to this is individual dialogue between the philosopher and the engineer, or in my case, between myself and my students. And I'll begin to do this fall. And the purpose of that would be to cultivate the capacity to think in terms of examples of the case. Ideally, we would like students and professionals to begin with standard cases, but then to develop their own cases, to be able to think in terms of a narrative, to think in terms of what an ideal, of what an admirable engineer would do. Or we'll look at concepts. Take something as simple as integrity. What is integrity? Well, it means wholeness initially. That's large and wet. Wholeness. Let's see. What would an absence of wholeness be? Being dissolute or something. So to begin to cultivate the capacity to be somewhat analytical, but more importantly, to think in terms of examples, which I think, in thinking for oneself, are more powerful, particularly in terms of taste, than conceptual analysis would be more useful.
One last question. Do you think that this idea of helping people to stop being thoughtless and being more thoughtful, is that something that can go beyond the academic world?
I certainly hope so. That this would not be useful at all. What I'm doing is to give them an example. And the next step is to do this with working professionals. And I will begin that this fall. And if this works, then other philosophers would need to be creative in being able to identify the opportunities for doing it. Where is their thoughtlessness? And what can philosophers do to mitigate it?
Well, very interesting. So the role of philosophical practice from that perspective is to make us more thoughtful and to develop our own moral taste, or more generally a more thoughtful attitude to life's basic questions.
Yes, indeed. If I may, being thoughtful not in the sense of determining what the truth is, but just the activity of thinking, of musing about something, which is what Socrates did.
Thank you very much, Jon.
Thank you.